Yeah, I think we're going to go ahead and start. So hello and welcome to the Legal Food Hub's winter webinar series. My name is Mary Egan and I'll be moderating the presentation. I work for the Legal Food Hub, which is a project of Conservation Law Foundation. We work to connect farmers, food entrepreneurs, and nonprofits in the food space to pro bono attorney support. If you live in New England and are in any of those careers, you're welcome to visit our website, www.legalfoodhub.org, and apply for our services. We'll determine if you're financially eligible, discuss your legal goals, and then work to find an attorney who can assist you for free. We also create educational materials. We have a resource library on our website with brief legal guides and webinars covering various topics, like this webinar. Our legal resources are designed to provide participants with foundational legal knowledge before meeting with an attorney. Today, we'll be learning about the legal side of hosting food-focused on-farm events. We'll be recording this session, and assuming all goes well, we'll be emailing and posting the recording shortly after the event for your future reference. We have a great panel joining us today. So Corie Pierce is going to be kicking us off. She's the owner of Bread and Butter Farm in Shelburne, Vermont. She wears all hats on the farm. She began farming as a 14-year-old in New Hampshire and passionately believes that farming and learning about how nature and growing food intersect is one of the most important things we could learn as humans. Corie has hosted hundreds of on-farm food events and is here to share with us her experience from over the years. After Corie, we'll have Dr. Lisa Chase. Dr. Chase is the director of the Vermont Tourism Research Center and extension professor at the University of Vermont. Her research and outreach focus on the intersection of food systems, community vitality, tourism, and working landscapes. For over 20 years, she has worked with entrepreneurs, communities, farmers, and tourism businesses in Vermont and around the globe. Lastly, but not leastly, Andrew Marchev is a fellow with the Vermont Legal Food Hub, a collaboration between the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems at Vermont Law School and Conservation Law Foundation. Andrew received his BA from Warren Wilson College and his JD from Vermont Law School. Andrew has his own solo practice in Montpelier with an agricultural focus. His dream is to have a little farm of his own and a thriving agricultural law practice. We'll be rooting for you, Andrew. Our presentation will close at 1. Then we'll have a question and answer session, but feel free to submit questions in the chat box throughout the presentation, but we'll most likely address them at the end. With that, I'm going to hand the time over to Corie.
All right, thank you. So, yeah, I'm Corie Pierce. I founded and started Bread and Butter Farm about 13 years ago up here. We're on the town line actually of Shelburne and South Burlington, and our farm is a conserved farm through the Vermont Land Trust. I mentioned that we're on the town line because that means that we are navigating 2 municipalities when it comes to things like on-farm events and other things. But I'd say that on-farm events, you know, the fact that we're in 2 different towns is like fairly significant for that. Just a quick overview of what we do and just like get a sense of how many people are coming to our farm. So we're located just about 7 miles from downtown Burlington, which means that we're in a very good location to be very active and have a lot of people come to our farm. So in the summertime, we kind of got our name on the map by sort of very innocently hosting these weekly burger nights when we had our grass-fed beef, the first year that our grass-fed beef was ready to be sold. And we thought how cute it would be to have a grill going and serve a few burgers. And we quickly learned that it was very wildly successful. And we had to, if we wanted to keep doing, we had to really figure out how to handle the crowd. So now we limit it to about 500 people. We do depends on the year, obviously with COVID and all that, between 4 and 12 events a year. We pre-ticket the event. We do much smaller workshops in the summertime for CSA members, for general public, and those are anywhere from like 5 to 30 people. We do a lot of educational programming on the farm for children, but for adults, we have done similar type of program we call the Adult Village School, which is basically outdoor-based education out in the woods, on the farm, and we do that for adults as well. My husband is not a farmer, he's a musician, so music has been very integral to the work that we have done in terms of community building. So we have hosted a lot of different music events, some of which are burger nights, but also standalone music events. We're adding barn dances to our newly renovated dairy hay barn. So we're gonna have some like contra dances and things like that. So that'll be new. And then a collaboration that we have with another business here on our farm, a catering and bakery business called Blank Page Cafe. He actually hosts these Friday tacos, which isn't a tremendous amount of on-farm visits from a standpoint of handling those people, but it does drive a lot of traffic in addition to our regular stuff that we do, including CSA and all the other events. So we've gotten very good at understanding what we need to do from our town standpoint, the state standpoint, and all the various regulatory agencies. You can switch the slides. I thought it would be helpful to just throw out the things that like both we did consider before running events, but then also that we've learned since running events. So answering the questions for yourself, are you ready to open your farm to the community and all what comes with that? I recommend having a dedicated person. So, and that's been me. I've slowly delegated some of the responsibility, but I think to start on farm events, a farm owner really most often needs to be the person dedicated to it, just given all the liability side and the motivation to really learn how to do it right. And then staffing of these things can be challenging since they're not like a full-time job or even a very regular part-time job. So being able to staff them is a big question. Also, this is a whole other realm of work. So for me as a farmer, as a new business owner back 13 years ago, just all of it is like, we had to really ask ourselves, is this worth me putting the amount of time I would need in to figure all this out to make it worth my time? And then can you market them? Sometimes these things market themselves, but sometimes you really need to market them, and it's sort of different than selling food. And all of this, you know, to be said is like making sure it's financially viable. Okay, you can switch slides. So I want to talk about kind of the three kind of key things, the food part, the people management part, and then the event flow. Okay, switch slides. So I'm going to start with event flow. So again, having somebody who's dedicated to like understanding what the event is and what the flow is going to be. This has really been, I'm the event flow person sort of overall, but then in terms of our music and this first bullet of like greeting people and kind of holding the event, my husband has done that, given he's that's what he does. He's a performer. And so he feels very comfortable with that. And that has benefited us greatly. I don't love being on a mic. And I've seen events run just fine without that, but having him, someone who can hold that, has been really amazing. Having very clear vision for the events and then translating that to your people coming. So signage, clear and obvious places for people to go. Obviously the bathrooms, hand washing, trash recycling, compost stations, is that it all flows and makes sense. And of course, parking is on here too. I didn't put that on this slide, but that's part of the event flow. Okay, next slide. So I put these separate: parking management and just generally large crowds. For us, we actually park people across the street and have to cross them to get to where the events take place, which adds an extra challenge for us. Just again, the liability of crossing people on a fairly, it's a back town road, but it's not insignificantly busy. So we put a lot of investment into parking and traffic control. And that's, I actually spend, at this point in our running of events, I spend the majority of my time in the parking lot because it's probably the place where we have the most potential liability. Again, large crowds is just again, thinking through the flow and that you really understand how you're going to handle those crowds or what the size of your event's going to be. Okay, next slide. So people management, this has evolved for us as our events have evolved and also as I've been able to delegate some of the work. So again, events have actually become a very good additional set of hours available to our farm team. So we've been able to leverage, like get people who are dedicated to us to work the events, and also who are interested in more hours. It's also really been a team building thing for us. But being able to hold that, one of the mistakes that we made in the first early years, because we didn't know how busy these events were going to be, was just sort of adding working at events onto our already full-time farm people. And we quickly saw that was going to burn people out. So being able to be like, okay, you're working in our veggie gardens for 30 hours a week. And in the high event season, you're, 10 hours a week is dedicated to events, and just making sure we're not asking people to work above and beyond that. At this point, we have a person who is dedicated, that's not me, to holding the team and kind of the cheerleader and the rallier of the team, and just managing everybody's roles and knowing exactly what people's roles are. So it's really clear and the management is successful. Next one. And then the food. So food is probably where the regulatory side of things on the state level and even town level comes in the most. So we have here in Vermont have used the fair stand permit, which is basically the same kind of food license from the health department that people use who are selling and serving food at, say, farmers markets or at fairs or festivals or things like that. And that's good for us with our burger nights because it covers a limited number of events per year and allows us to do what we want to do. We have a unique situation in that we have an on-farm certified kitchen that we didn't have initially. We had a bakery, but not a kitchen. So early years, we actually used kitchens from other caterers to do the food prep. And then we would bring the food to our farm and then rode the fair stand permit to be able to serve food. But the food prep side of it was done off site. Now that we have put caterer's license into place into our kitchen, we're able to do that all here, which makes a huge difference and is wonderful. So I think that from a legal standpoint, we have the fair stand permit, which then has an annual inspection in person from the health inspector. And then from the town's perspective, doing these different types of businesses that aren't just growing or raising food. We have changed our zoning actually to be what's called, oh my gosh, blanking. We moved from being just zoned as ag to something else that my town, Shelburne, has. I'm spacing it right now, but it basically allows for secondary, supportive, auxiliary food related enterprises to occur without any issues. Now, the state of Vermont, and Andrew, I think you can speak to this, has passed in recent years a legislation that allows all municipalities, all farms in different municipalities, to leverage that auxiliary business model. But it does go town to town in terms of how challenging or not challenging that is for different farms and different towns. The last thing I want to say is one thing that we did from the beginning that I think was the best thing that we possibly could have done was go around neighbor to neighbor in our immediate quote unquote neighborhood and talk to all of our neighbors about what we were planning on doing and how much outside engagement we were planning to have with our community, and bringing them into our events, essentially inviting them in. Some of them volunteer at them, some of them work at them, some of them just come and we give them free tickets, just make them be a part of it and feel like the impact that we inevitably have with that many people coming to our farm and the increased traffic and all that is a fun thing and not a burden to them as our neighbors. And they all love it. And one advice that has been given to me was, if you don't ever have any complaints on record on your town level, that's going to work in your best interest in order to be able to keep doing these things, since there is somewhat of a gray area of like exactly how all of these types of events work. And we did that, and yeah, we have incredible support from our neighbors. All right, I'm going to leave it there.
Did you want to talk about the checklist at all, Corie, or should I jump in?
I feel like I've gone over my time, so I think this checklist is helpful, and I think I touched on almost all of these things, so I think we can keep moving.
Okay, I just want to say, Corie, I could listen to you all day. Part of the reason why I was so excited for this webinar today is I've been following, even though I'm down, so I should say I'm with University of Vermont Extension in the Vermont Tourism Research Center, and I'm down in Brattleboro, but I work statewide, and more and more work in other states, and even nationally and internationally as agritourism has been growing. And I remember 13 years ago hearing about this bread and butter burger night thing, and then like hearing how it had taken off to the point where the farmers, Corie and other folks you worked with, were saying, oh my gosh, what do you do? What do you do when things go too well? How do you manage that? And it's been really exciting to see, as Bread and Butter Farm has said, okay, wait, we can manage this and we can control this. And even through COVID, and the different events that you've played around with and tried, and some you've kept and some you haven't. And I put that out there just to say, like, it's always a progression, and it's always a learning experience. So I know we've got a good mix of people here, some with a lot of experience with food events on their farm, some who are newer, and then also agricultural service providers like me, or I think I saw an insurance agent out there, who are trying to give answers to farms who call up or send an email and say, hey, I want to do this. What should I do? And I should mention that everybody should feel free to drop questions into Q&A at any time. I see somebody just did that. So for those of you who aren't so familiar with Q&A, if you look at the bottom of your screen, there's a little Q&A box, and you can put questions in at any time. And, if they're directed to Corie or somebody else, we may be able to answer them, type in answers as we go, or at the end, after Andrew is done, Mary will open it up and lead a discussion. I'm gonna take a step back, zoom out, and talk a little more broadly about agritourism for a few minutes before we dive back into the morass that is the legal issues, the legal side, as well as the zoning and the permitting and the insurance and all that fun stuff. So the reason why I've got this picture here, courtesy of Historic New England, is just to show the history of gathering on farms and having food on farms. I mean, this picture is 170 years old, maple sugaring. And really, there's documented evidence that we've been coming together on farms since the dawn of agriculture. And certainly, here in Vermont, where it's Abenaki land, there's a lot of great history of people coming together for sugaring and other planting and harvesting and celebrations. And pretty much all of them have to do with food. Can I have the next slide, Mary? So what's new, so what we're doing is not so new. What's new, though, is that now, here in the US, less than 2% of the population actually works on farms. So most people are super disconnected, totally disconnected from food. They don't know where it comes from. They don't understand anything about food production. And we all owe a great debt of gratitude to our farms that are willing to open up and invite visitors on and show them and have them experience, here's where food actually comes from. So this term agritourism, which isn't necessary, branching out a little bit, it's not necessarily a food related event, but I will say a lot of agritourism does involve food in some way. This term agritourism started in the 1980s in Italy, Agriturismo, as kind of a way to encourage farms to bring people back to the rural countrysides, maintain their farm buildings, and basically as a way to promote farm viability and also get visitors out to farms. Since then, it's grown across the globe, and it encompasses direct sales as well as events, recreation, experience, and education. And we're looking at globally an agritourism market. This is a couple years ago in 2021 of over 9 billion with 12% growth projected. And this is even through the pandemic. It was very interesting to see agritourism was sort of, on a steady trajectory, generally going up. And then the pandemic hit. And the impacts on agritourism really vary depending on the type of experience you were offering. So you pick and walks on farms, visiting farm stands, all of that skyrocketed during the pandemic, when going to farms and being outdoors and being socially distanced from people was a really important thing. So we saw unprecedented demand for CSA shares and farm stands on farms because nobody wanted to go to the supermarket anymore. And, what felt better? What felt more safe than going a few miles away to the farmer? You know how the food is grown, you know how it's produced, you know who's there. Feels really good. So we saw that spike, back in 2020, but at the same time, the events, the things like Burger Night, where you've got 500 people coming together, those were curtailed, as well as in some places here in Vermont, overnight farm stays done. Our hotels were closed for a while, but in other states it stayed open. Now that the pandemic, now that the pandemic has evolved and changed for the past few years, what we've seen is this interest in agritourism is still growing, and especially for these outdoor events on farms. And while some people are still much more careful, they're not going on cruises, they're not going to Disney World, other people are back at those places, but we're seeing that the demand for agritourism is still huge. However, what I've been hearing, I'm looking forward to having some better data on this, but what I've been hearing is that interest in CSA shares and some of the direct sales pieces have leveled off since the pandemic and maybe returning, maybe, even dropping now that people are going back to the supermarket. Could I have the next slide, Mary? So that's looking at an international perspective. Here in the US, these data are rather old. It's from the 2017 Census of Agriculture. They just finished up collecting data for the 2022 Census of Agriculture. So in another several months, we'll finally hear where we're at in 2022. But for now, what I want to say is we're looking at, back in 2017, almost 4 billion in sales from the combination of direct sales of food, which could be off farm as well as agritourism and recreational services, and over 150,000 farms across the US. Next slide, Mary. Zooming in here in Vermont, and I've got to apologize to all you folks who came from other states. The Legal Food Hub is open, provides services for everyone in New England. I realize we have a bit of a Vermont emphasis here with our panel today, but we'll, make sure we're talking to everyone. And I know I took a look at the registration list, so I know that not everyone is even from New England. So we'll, try to talk in broad terms. So here in Vermont, again, 2017 data, I'm really excited to see what 2022 looks like, but we're looking at over 50 million in sales of direct sales and agritourism, and around 2,000 farms. And I'm going to say throughout New England, agritourism, the direct sales, the on-farm events, often with food, those are very important. Could I have the next slide? So to better understand the concerns of producers, we did a survey This is back in 2019, 2020, just before COVID hit. And we asked a whole bunch of different questions. And we wanted this to complement what we learned from the Census of Ag, where we get the number of farms and we get revenue, but that's all we get. So we asked about products and activities, motivations, challenges, all sorts of questions that I don't have time to go into now, but Mary is going to drop a link into chat. And the link is also on the bottom of this slide. So if you're interested in digging more into the data, feel free to reach out to me or check out our website where we've got reports and summaries and different publications. Could I have the next slide? For the purpose of today's discussion, though, what I wanted to highlight are some challenges for agritourism operators. These are the top 10 challenges identified nationally. And as you can see, some of them, like time management and labor, especially right now, labor, are concerns for everyone. But there are certain issues here that are challenges, especially for agritourism operators. Mary, can you click the button a few times and you'll see a few red circles coming up? So concerns about liability issues, that's good. Oh, back one, I should, yeah. So some of the things that rose to the forefront that are very relevant for today are concerns about liability issues, the cost and availability of liability insurance. And these are only issues if you're inviting people on your farm. I mean, granted, you have to worry about liability for your farm and your farm workers, no matter what kind of farm you have. However, once you're inviting visitors onto your farm, it's a whole new world. And then also state and local regulations that Andrew's going to talk a lot more about and Corie touched on. Could I have the next slide? Part of what makes this so complicated is that here in the US, it's a hodgepodge by state, by county, by town, municipality. The rules and regulations differ. Unlike certain countries like Scotland, they've got a unified definition of agritourism, and they've got unified policies across the country that are all very standardized. We've got nothing like that here in the US. We don't have a shared definition. And one really important issue is having a limited liability law for agritourism. And here, this is a map of the various states, and the colors are when a civil liability law was enacted. If your state is gray, you still don't have one. Vermont finally enacted one in 2021. Maine did it several years before. The first ones were enacted, back about 20 years ago in Kansas and Kentucky. And little by little, a lot more states have come on board. But New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, last I checked, which was shortly before, just a few days ago, I did not see evidence of a limited liability law for agritourism. Could I have the next slide, Mary? And so for those of you in Vermont, and those of you in Maine, you may be used to seeing these signs, warning, these are not very friendly signs. In fact, I was giving some to farms, and one of the farmers looked at it and said, this is so unfriendly, I don't want to put it up. What if I cover up warning and put like welcome on top? I'm like, you can put welcome on the very top, the very top of the sign, but this is a sign that was written by legislators. So it's about protecting your farm, not so much about welcoming visitors onto your farm. You still can welcome them, but you can't mess with the language of the sign that's been enacted in the legislation. And then there was another farmer standing by who said, oh, I like this. This is going to scare people. So, different people are coming with different perspectives. Here in Vermont in July of 2021, our act relating to limiting liability from agritourism took effect. And if you are doing events on your farm, you should get one of these signs, and you can always reach out to me and I can help you understand how to get one of these signs. And if you've got a waiver that people are signing for summer camp or events or whatever, this is the language that you should be including. And I have had farms that say, oh, now that I have this sign and we have this new legislation, that means I don't need insurance, right? I don't need liability insurance anymore, right? Wrong. You still need liability insurance. This is one additional layer of protection, but there's still, unfortunately, there's still lots more you have to do. Could I have the next slide, Mary? And it can get very confusing as to what you need to do depending on the type of event that you're planning to host. So I worked with some folks, and we including Tara Pereira from the Vermont Fresh Network, and we put together a guide to navigating agritourism regulations in Vermont. Apologies for all of you out of state. You might have something like this in your state that I can help you find, or we can help you figure out where to go to navigate the regulations, but it can be very confusing. And we also worked very closely with the Vermont Agency of Agriculture and the Department of Health to put this together. So, and you can see the link. Actually, Mary will drop the link into chat. Perfect, on cue. There's also a QR code. So for those of you who've got a cell phone handy, if you want to pull this up yourself, you can click on the QR code and it will bring you to this web page. And I've got the same QR code on a few more web pages, because if you're like me, it's going to take you a while to find your phone. And now I got to click on this thing. So can we go? So if you were looking on this page live, we would click on that button that says on-farm events, and that will take us to the next page. Mary, can I have the next slide? So zooming in on on-farm events gives you a little more information about what you would need to know. And here in Vermont, one of the good things is that according to the Vermont Department of Health, if you are having food service activities that are less often than occasional, which means less often than once a month, you actually don't need a license from the Vermont Department of Health. You still may need other licenses, but if it's less than once a month, you don't need, or you're kind of just trying it for the first time, you don't need to get a license from the Vermont Department of Health. However, when you do need licenses, like Corie mentioned, the temporary food stand license or the fair stand permit is one that works well if you're doing events more regularly. And then you can see these drop-down boxes for land use regulations, permits, liability, licenses, and additional resources. Pretending we're clicking on licenses. Mary, can you turn the page? Turn to the next slide. Here's what one up. Yep. Here we are on the licenses page, which gives you some background on the types of licenses and permits that you might need, including a table. On this slide, you can only see the top of the table: dairy, frozen desserts. We've got meat, fruits and veggies, prepared foods, all sorts of other things. If you go to the website, that can help you figure out where to go. It's a lot. I know it's a lot. And we also have people you can turn to help you navigate this. Mary, could I have the next slide, please? So, and for those of you who prefer more of a checklist format, you just want a PDF that you can scroll through and see it all at once, you can also find that on the website. And it talks about land use regulations, including Act 143, which Corie Pierce mentioned earlier, the Accessory On-Farm Businesses Act, that the intention is to make it easier for farms to be able to have events, but it's still can be challenging depending on what you're planning on doing and where exactly you're located, as well as permits, liability, licenses, and additional resources. Can I have the next slide, Mary? And this is my last slide. In closing, what I wanted to do is tell you, it is confusing, but don't let that deter you. It also can be very rewarding. And once you make your way through the maze, then you get to know what's involved, and it's easier once you've found your way through the maze, but it certainly can feel like a lot in the beginning. And sometimes you may want to actually reach out to a person and say, oh, what do I do? Where do I go? So since the Legal Food Hub serves all of New England, and I wanted to list contacts in New England states, which with permission of my colleagues, You'll notice Rhode Island is missing. I wasn't quite sure whom to list in Rhode Island. If anybody knows, let me know. But here we have Connecticut, Massachusetts, Maine, and New Hampshire contacts who have agreed to be put on this slide, some with Extension and some with their state departments of agriculture. Feel free to reach out to any of them or reach out to me and I'll help connect you, whether you're in New England or somewhere else. And now I'm going to turn it over to Andrew, who can talk a little bit about the Legal Food Hub, which serves all of New England, as well as a number of other resources.
Yes, hello everybody. I'm Andrew Marchev, as was mentioned. I'm a Vermont licensed attorney, and I've also worked for the Legal Food Hub. And I think, so I just, as a disclaimer, I know I'm already proving myself to be a lawyer, but I think Corie and Lisa have done an excellent job of covering some of the stuff that I was going to try to cover. And I want to try to do it in 15 to 20 minutes because I want there to be time for questions specifically for Lisa, because for what I understand, she has a hard out at noon, or at noon, sorry, at 1, even though we can go on for another 15 minutes. So next slide, please. So if you're going to set an agenda, I'll intro the Legal Food Hub and myself a little bit. Lawyers, again, we love definitions. So I was going to talk a little bit about what an on-farm event is legally, but I think Corie and Lisa have done a great job with that. So I'm going to just probably skip that. But then the third part I want to do is what I like to call need to asks, right? People ask me, what do I need to know? And I think just as important, and maybe even more important when it comes to these very localized issues, are knowing what the need to asks are, right? And so we're going to do that from a 20,000-foot view level, what I like to call law school in 2 minutes. And then we're going to zoom in on zoning, which is something I know a fair amount about, and some of the permitting, like Department of Health, fire. And then I know there's questions, as you should, about insurance, some of the safety aspects. But what's great, what the great news is that I don't have to squish all that into 10 minutes. There's a great video on that Legal Food Hub has already done. It's available in the Legal Food Hub resource library that you can watch, and it's still good information. And Dr. Chase was part of that video as well, so you can hear more from her. And I'll talk about that at the very end. And then hopefully I'll be able to do this all in time for some questions. So all that being said, bear with me. Next slide, please. So this is another, probably the one flattering picture of me that exists in front of the State House in Montpelier. I'm an attorney. I work for the Legal Food Hub. We match farmers and food entrepreneurs with attorneys who are willing to do work pro bono if you qualify. And there's information on that on the website. I work for the Vermont branch of the Legal Food Hub, which is within the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems, which I'd recommend looking up. We're a great resource for, we create a lot of educational resources on agriculture and food nationally, but also New England specific, if you want to check out our website. And we're part of the Vermont Law and Graduate School, which is a great institution. Next slide, please. And one back. So just quickly, I want to talk about how I'm going to present here. I know a lot of folks get annoyed when attorneys say, well, it depends. And I understand that frustration, right? Because you want answers. The tricky thing is that it's true, right? Legal advice, which to be clear, I'm not going to be giving, right? But legal answers to questions really depends on your specific facts and where you are located, right? And so that's true in any circumstance, but it's particularly true with things that are hyper localized like zoning and health department permits. So to reiterate, I won't be giving legal advice. I'm not going to be citing specific laws because I think that would be confusing in a context where we have a lot of folks from different states. But I'm going to give you general patterns, which I think will help you understand where to put information and where to look for answers to the questions that you might have, and ways to educate yourselves and to be able to do some self-help and some resources to do that help with. So next slide, please. So this is the part, sort of the on-farm event definition that I was going to do. I think Corie and Lisa did a great definition of that. You'll have access to these slides, but in a nutshell, I think it's important to think about the different relationships you have with your customers, with your employees, and with your neighbors, based on the fact that you're doing an on-farm event as opposed to your regular farm activities, right? So I think that's it's again a 20,000 foot view thing, but to think about how am I relating to these different people in my life differently because when I'm doing an on-farm event as opposed to these other things. Next slide, please. So as somebody said, doing an on-farm event is a whole new world, right? And like, and I do the little picture here from Aladdin to emphasize that. But it's like a Magic Carpet ride, there's a lot of exciting opportunities and different things that you might not be able to do if you're just on the ground, but there's also risks involved, right? And I think those risks are very manageable if you do some preparation and some self-reflection about what some of those risks are based on the specific kind of event that you want to do. Next slide, please. So what are the need to asks? I have this big long list of questions without categories, not so that you have to cram it all in right now, but just to give you a sense that there's a lot of questions you should be asking before hosting an on-farm event, right? And that's the scary part. I want to scare you a little bit at first. But you can manage it, I think, by starting to categorize these things. First, in a way that's more common sense, right? So if you can click next, please, Mary. So in common language, right? So these questions can be broken down into questions about safety. And I think Corie did a great job of addressing that. Questions about what expectations are you setting? And those are things from a legal perspective, like waivers and agreements. And I think Lisa did a great job of talking about that. And Corie talked a lot about, thinking about what are the impact on your neighbors? How does relations with your neighbors change? So if you can click twice again, Mary. Interestingly, these common sense categories also match up pretty nicely with areas of the law, right? And so safety you can think about as personal injury or torts. Agreements in your expectation setting can be with contracts, right? And those don't have to just be forms, they can also be, again, signs that are in the front of, at the entrance of your farm. That is, I'm speaking in generalities here, but in a sense, it's a form of contract, right? You're setting the terms. You say, if you come any further, I don't have any liability. You should understand that. And that's, as Lisa was saying, that's the importance of having that exact language. And then if the person crosses it, that's the equivalent of their signature on the contract. They've had the chance to review the terms and they've accepted the terms, right? And in a common sense way, that's expectation setting, right? I teach a class here too. I joke with my students that setting law is also good for relationships. You want full informed consent before you begin activities, right? And so that's a good way to think about it, right? There's a legal aspect of it that may seem bureaucratic, but there's a nugget within there that's common sense. So anyway, I probably intimidated you enough with these questions. So if you'll go to the next slide, please, Mary. Let me intimidate you with even more questions you should be asking, right? Which are employment law. How are you dealing with how are you interacting with your employees differently? Some of you may have agricultural exemptions that you're using for farm labor. Those don't apply necessarily on farm events, right? I'm not going to be talking about those, but there are a lot of great resources in the Legal Food Hub resource website about those. And another thing, so on the right side here, there's what I'm calling agricultural exceptions. A lot of these laws have exceptions, right? And so some of the Act 143 aspects are designed to help farms be able to access and to be able to have accessory businesses without necessarily some of these other liabilities, right? So that's the other question. It's like, once you find out, like, gosh, okay, there's this permit that I need, maybe, but is there an exception that applies to farms? So that's yet another question to have for yourself, right? But I think if you think about it in those categories, it helps keep it organized. Administrative law are things that are related to the executive branch of a government, and that can be federal, but in this case, it's going to be mostly state. And those are things like Department of Health and the permits that you might need for a food stand or a food truck. I saw one of the questions from folks was about a food truck, right? And so that's where that, if you're speaking to a lawyer, and that's the other reason I include these categories, right? Is that if you do reach a level where you think, I do want to go to the Legal Food Hub and get a lawyer and ask them about these questions, these are ways to sort of translate into legalese what some of your concerns might be, right? So anyway, I think that's enough for this slide. If you go to the next slide, Mary. And then one last thing, insurance, right? I know some of you have questions about insurance. Again, there's a great Legal Food Hub webinar about that with an insurance agent and an insurance attorney who could speak to it better than I can. But briefly, I'll give you what little bit I can speak to about it, is that it is really important to have. So get some if you don't already. But another thing that I found really interesting is that once you have insurance, you can call the insurance company and ask them questions about stuff. And since it's already a service that you're paying for, and there's differences between companies, right? But in my experience, the insurance agents may be willing to talk to you about some of these questions and how best to approach them, right? And so they're among the other resources like the University of Ag Extension and Legal Food Hub, they're another resource as well. And the last little bit under insurance is, I say it's better to ask and find out than to not ask and find out later anyway, right? So if you go to the next slide, please. So this brings us to the two things I'm going to focus on: zoning and then permits. I say focus on it. I am going to give it a little bit of short shrift, but hopefully in a way that's still helpful to you. So next slide, please. So zoning. I think a lot of you have heard of zoning, so you have a sense for what it means. And you've probably also heard of planning. They are related, but they're not exactly the same thing. Planning is the sort of overarching thing. It's related to a town plan or city plan or county plan, depending on which municipal unit is relevant to you. But the plans started to be put in place many, many years ago, but as development started to ratchet up in pace, and it was this idea, there's certain ways in which towns developed that didn't make any sense and hurt people rather than help them. So there's a sense of we need to start literally planning how the town's going to develop over time, right? And so that was the first overarching thing that was implemented. And then zoning was this other tool that came after that implemented, not literally, but it's at least a helpful way for me to think about it, under planning, which is dividing municipal entities, municipal units into zones. So in order to have, for example, a central market district, commercial district, an industrial district, residential areas, rural, residential, and ag on the outskirts. Different towns do it different ways. But the idea being, we'll be able to plan better if we think about different parts of our town differently. And because it's broken up into areas, zoning tends to have the more specific regulations a lot of the time. And that tends to be the more applicable aspect to on-farm events. Unless you're subdividing a piece of your farm to develop it into, sell it to developers to make a housing development, planning is usually not going to come into effect. Speaking generally, but most of the time, you're not going to need to worry about that. You're going to be interested in zoning. So I think I covered all the aspects there. Oh, I just want to say, I think most people understand this, but municipal, just to be clear, it's a level below the state in terms of law. And so it's your town, city, or county. So I'll be talking a lot about municipal law and municipalities as we talk about zoning. Next slide, please. So zoning, what is it? Ideally, it's a compromise between you being able to do what you want with your land and the municipality being able to mediate the impacts that you might have on your neighbors, right? Depending on the town, this compromise sometimes isn't handled so well, or it goes more in one direction than the other. But that's the ideal, right? That's what zoning is aiming for. Like I said, zoning divides municipalities into zones. I have an example here of the Marshfield zoning map. And it's small, so you can't read it, but mainly what I want you to get from it is it's color coded. And so that indicates what the different zones are, and it connects to the street map. And so if, which I'll get to later when you want to see what your zoning regulations are. But for now, understanding what zoning is, there's a different mix of uses for each zone. Zoning regulations are typically triggered by construction or major renovation, but applicable to you all, a dramatic enough change in use of a building or land will also trigger zoning. And the primary tools of zoning are prohibition and review. You're either not allowed to do something or you are allowed to do it as long as you ask for permission nicely, and that takes the form of a conditional use permit application. And there might be different terms for it depending where you are, but I'm pretty sure that that part at least is fairly universal, the conditional use permit application. So next slide, please. And forgive me, I'm moving pretty quickly. So here's, I'm just going to give you a quick example of Ben & Jerry's. So this is a Google map picture of the Ben & Jerry's factory. And I believe this was an Act 250, which is a Vermont specific thing, but it's related to zoning. And they wanted to build their factory in Waterbury. And essentially what the relevant agency or the relevant board said to them is, sure, you can build your factory there, but you're going to increase traffic significantly. So that's, again, the zoning trigger. There's some impact on neighbors or the roads. And so they said, we'll give you the permit if you agree to pay for widening the road and putting this left-hand turn lane. And so that's what you see there. And so it's part of the town road, but Ben & Jerry's had to pay for it. Right. And so that was their conditional use permit. The use was allowed. They said, okay, it was a large development. And so there was a condition set. Anything that you do is very unlikely to have that big a condition set, but that's the formula, right? So this sort of to understand how, if you need to get a conditional use permit, how the process might occur. They get back to you, they do a review process. They'll probably say yes, but have some conditions. Next slide, please. So, but again, related to, I suspect most of you will be in what most zoning maps will call rural, residential, and agriculture. And some of you will be in towns that don't even have zoning. If you're in Vermont, you'll only Act 250 will apply. So there's a question, does it even apply to me, right? And I can't answer that for you, but I'm going to show you how you can answer it. And the other question too is whether the use you want to have is permitted or conditional, and whether it would be considered agricultural or commercial. So those are the key questions as far as zoning is concerned. Oh, and what zone are you in, which I'm about to talk about. If you go to the next slide, please. Is there even zoning, right? So if you're able to ask, somebody like a lawyer, they'll be able to look it up for you and give you the answer. I understand that might be challenging for you, so I want to give you some tips on how I would do it, right? So if you go to the town's website, you want to look for some key terms like zoning, planning, town plan, or land use. Ideally, there's a link to the zoning regulations right on the website, and it should be called that. But sometimes, I did a little bit of an experiment. I looked at some towns in Maine and Massachusetts, and I couldn't always find them. So that may happen to you as well. So the next best thing, if you can't find zoning regulations, find the person to ask, right? And that ideally would be a zoning administrator. If you can't find somebody with that title, the planning board is not likely going to be able to give you the answer, but they'll be able to point you to the right person, the head of the planning board. Some very small towns, for example, in Maine, have something called a code enforcement officer. And they're just in charge of enforcing the entire municipal code, including zoning. So that would be, if you're in a very rural part of Maine and some other parts of New England, that would be the other key term to look for. And lastly, the Development Review Board, they review big developments, but they will be in contact with whoever's in charge of zoning. And so again, it's not the best case scenario. You want to find zoning administrator, but in a lot of these smaller towns, folks are used to getting emails from random people. And if you ask nicely and say, I can't find the zoning, can you send me in the right direction? They will likely respond to you. If you can't find any of those folks, I'd say the town clerk, town manager, or if you're in one of the southern states, they usually divide up by counties. They have equivalents, county clerk, county manager, and they should be able to, again, point you in the right direction. They might not have the exact zoning regs. Next slide, please. And so let's look at this in action. So here's Marshfield again. I've been doing some work in Marshfield, and I have the website up at the top if you want to take a look. I think they do a good job, and so that's why I picked them. So if you click on the next slide, Mary. So you see right on the left here, zoning and planning, right? So we will click on that. Next slide, please. And then that brings you to a page, zoning and planning. If you do next slide a couple of times. So we've got the zoning information, we've got the zoning administrator on the right, a couple more times. There's the applications on the bottom. Development Review Board minutes is less applicable, but that's another thing you might find. And zoning documents and fees. And you'll see here links to the town plan and current regulations. That's what you're looking for. So if you click on that, next slide, please, you'll see, and I edited a little bit, the zoning documents and fees. If you click next slide again, you'll see zoning map. And next slide again. Or sorry, next, just click next, should pop up. There you go, zoning regulations. And so those are the two things that you're gonna use to figure out what zone you're in and what regulations apply. So if you go to the next slide. So what zone am I in? So you use the legend to understand the zone, you find where you are on the map, and let's assume that you're rural, residential or ag, because that's where most farms are located. And you'd use this, and most maps, they're able to zoom in, right? So don't worry about it being this small. I have to fit it on the slide, but they're usually larger. Let's go to the next slide. Once you know what zone you're in, the regulations will have a table of contents that lead you to the zone. And they are long. You'll see it's section 420. They're long regulations, but using the table of contents, you can zoom right to where you need to go. And on the left here, you see permitted uses, and there's more in Marshfield, don't worry. Those aren't the only two things you can do in Marshfield. And I should say, there's a weird language thing, which happens a lot in the law, and I do apologize. Permitted uses means what you can do without having to ask anybody. They're allowed, right? So even though it has the word permit in it, it's actually, you don't need a permit for those. Permitted uses are, you can just do it without asking anybody. The one you might need to worry about, so if what you want to do is in there, great, go ahead. As far as zoning is concerned, you're good to go. If what you want to do is in the conditional use, then that's when you'd have to do an application and go through the process. And that's where you might need some help from an attorney, or at least talk to a town clerk. Oh, so yeah, and I'm trying to move quickly. Sorry, Lisa. Thanks for joining us. And so there's a list here as an example of what the conditional use permits or conditional uses are in Marshfield. Next slide, please. And so I talked a little bit about this, right? And so we talked about permitted uses, or you're allowed. Conditional uses require review, you need to apply. If the use is neither permitted nor conditional, that means it's prohibited. And so that's where, if you don't see it at either list, that's where you really need to get worried, because that's the zoning regulations saying, nope, never. And that's where I would say definitely talking to the zoning folks to double check to make sure. Am I understanding this correctly? Are you trying to prohibit this in this area? And it's very possible, right? Some of the language in these regulations are kind of archaic. It's possible that you might be reading it wrong, right? But if they say yes, and you really need to, then that's definitely a time to talk to an attorney. However, most zoning regulations I've seen, there's not many things that are fully prohibited, right, in the uses. So next slide, please. So looking back at the website again, so once you know what your use is, and then click next again. And if it's a conditional use, you'd go to applications. And so that's hopefully on the website clear. Next again. So zoning, take a breather because there's a lot of information. Now I'm going to talk even more briefly about health permits and fire permits. So again, thinking about it's before you get to know what you need to know what you need to ask. And so the questions for this topic would be, does your town, county, or state have a Department of Health? And at which level? Because different states do it differently. Sometimes they're local to the town, sometimes they're in the state. And what kinds of activities are permits required for? How do they categorize things? So restaurants are a common one. I assume most of your events won't fit within that necessarily. But hotels, motels, B&Bs often require permits. Entertainment venues like movie theaters, things like that, or dance halls. And they might have some archaic term for it, but it relates to hosting a bunch of people inside and having them have to pay tickets. And then food truck and catering. Some towns will have specific food truck permits. Others it'll relate more to catering. And in Vermont, and I think in other states, there's a lot of home-based food businesses permits, which in some sense, I guess it's annoying because it's another permit you have to apply for, but they're actually designed to be much more accessible and much less strict, right? And so that's the good news. But in general, and I say other, right? But in general, it's like figure out what your activity is and try to figure out where in the permitting structure it fits. And then once you know, you figure out what's required. And then also figure out if your event requires several permits, multiple permits. Next slide, please. And so I have some examples here. So here's Maine, which has a sort of a mixed state and local version. That they administer it from the state, but then they have local people and they call it a health inspection program. And then in New Hampshire, they have these folks called health officers and deputy health officers. And I have a link there that it's a PDF that's available online, and it's by town. And then in Vermont, that's fine. Yep, you can go to Vermont. And in Vermont, it's also a combination of state administered, but towns can be delegated the authority, and then it's divided by region and town. And it's this particular document, which has on the bottom right there is the URL to access it. And if you go to the next slide, please. Maybe I jumped ahead, but in terms of health permits, and I'd say in general, my experience with times that I've had to reach out to these folks is that if you're asking ahead of time, you're saying, I'm thinking about doing X, Y, and Z, or I'd like to do X, Y, and Z. They tend to be helpful and they tend to be excited about wanting to help you with it, right? And they'll be able to give you the information. And maybe that's more Vermont specific, that we just have a friendly bureaucracy. But when I had to call the state of Vermont about different things, even not as an attorney, that they've been able to point me in the right direction. So I'd encourage you to just go direct to the source, right? And if it still leaves you with questions, then but hopefully it'll clarify, right? So that then you can go to some of these other resources. But I'd say, get it straight from the horse's mouth, right? Which brings me to the next point about fire permits. Fire permits, at least in Vermont, they're usually triggered by specific kinds of new construction. Sometimes they're triggered by major renovations or changes. Certainly renovations that involve a lot of new electrical or plumbing. And sometimes, again, a major change in use. And I use that term major change. I hate to be squishy about it because again, that's going to depend on where you are. But in general, I would say that if you are opening up your farm to a wedding once or once a year even, that doesn't seem likely to be a major change or considered regular, right? It's once it starts to be becoming a regular part of your business, and I'm speaking in generalities here again, but that's where things start to be triggered more, right? One quick Vermont thing, I don't know if it applies to other states, but it might. Very large tents, in Vermont is 12,000 square feet tent or greater, do require permits and they require an inspection. But that's a fairly large tent as far as I can tell. And fireworks require a permit too. I don't want to speak for New Hampshire there, but I think most places require fireworks, a permit for fireworks. Next slide. And here's an example of the for short-term rentals. I don't know how many of you all are doing bed and breakfast kind of things, but as the Vermont Division of Fire Safety about short-term rentals. Go to the next slide. And so that's on permits. I'd say key takeaways are new construction and major changes in use tend to be the triggers that require some form of permitting from a state or municipal authority, and that it's always good to go direct to the source. And I'd say if you have questions about it, if you're not sure, better to ask and find out then than to find out later, right? Next slide. And I'll say quickly, and I'll go through, but here's what the Legal Food Hub resource library looks like, and the URL. If you go to the next slide, this is the presentation that included Dr. Chase, and where a lot of the good information on insurance is, and it includes Stuart Farnham, who's a great authority on the matter, and also they talk about a lot of the safety aspects as well, which I think Dr. Chase did a good job of covering in this presentation. If we want to dive in deeper, I'd say that's a good one to go to. I've watched it myself. Next slide, please. And then just in general, there's employment resources on the Legal Food Hub Resource Library. Next slide. And then these are some other excellent resources that I would recommend. And the slides I think have been sent to everybody as well. So next slide, please. So any questions? I think I can go a little over 1:15 at least. I don't want to speak for our other presenters, but.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you so much. So yeah, thank you, Corie and Lisa and Andrew. Two quick things before we transition to the Q&A. So we've already lost Lisa, but if you have Lisa specific questions, feel free to email me legalfoodhub@clf.org, and I'm happy to forward your questions specifically to Lisa. And then the other thing is, I'm going to put a link in the chat. This is a link to just a Google form questionnaire helping the hub assess the usefulness of our webinar series and to determine any changes we should make to this series in the future. Your thoughts are most welcome and appreciated if you have a second to fill the chat out. Excuse me, fill out the form. But in the meantime, if anyone has additional Q&A, please feel free to put your question in the Q&A feature of Zoom. One person I think already asked a great question that I'll vocalize in case other people have missed, and Corie was kind enough to answer it, but the question was targeting her barn in particular. So when you started hosting events in your barn, did you have to update the barn to meet commercial building codes with handicap access, fire safety, etc.? Or could you keep the barn as an ag building? Corie, I'm happy to read your answer, or if you feel like doing more to that, I'll turn it to you.
Yeah, we're renovating the barn in phases. We're also, just to be really clear, not intending on it being like a wedding venue. So it's more for us an extension of, in terms of like a covered space to be used for like some supporting other events that we're doing. So the reason why we're doing it in phases is because we don't have the money to do it kind of all at once. So no, it's not up to all the like, it's basically a renovated ag building that we're using as almost like a spillover space for our other events. We did, however, make a ramp that we did look at the code for wheelchair accessibility because we wanted it to be accessible. So I'm not 100% sure if it exactly matches it, because it's interesting how it interacts with our driveway. Anyway, we're not up to code on that front, and intentionally did it that way. So we'll kind of see how it gets used. Mostly we had to we wanted it for additional events, but we also had to make the choice of whether or not this building was going to fall to the ground or if we were going to save it. And we ended up getting a grant that allowed us to help save it so we could take this first step to renovate it.
Great. Thank you, Corie. One question I thought would be worth asking, because Andrew, Corie, you alluded in your presentation to having some zoning changed for your property. And then Andrew did a great job talking about like things that are prohibited versus permitted. And so do you feel like talking a little bit about that process of having some zoning changed?
Sure. Yeah, I think we were kind of floating in that gray area of like not being regular enough to sort of trigger the like major use or major change thing that Andrew was talking about, but kind of hanging out in that space enough that like if there had been complaints or if somebody had brought this up, that we were kind of flirting with being in the wrong zoning kind of rule. And honestly, it was interesting that the town zoning director person who we had worked with when we had built out our bakery, because we had to get permits for that, he actually had just approached me and was like, hey, just so you know, I'm kind of watching what you guys are doing and we love it as like far as the town goes in terms of what it's offering to our community. We love it. But just to cover your own basis, we do have this other zoning. I just don't know, I can't think of this, but we have, zoning term that's not agriculture, but it sort of is for businesses like you that are farms that are doing other things that are including auxiliary type businesses. So you might want to consider changing your zoning regulation to that. And it was a pain in the ass for sure, but we ended up doing it again, just as like a preemptive thing. So like, if in case we did get someone complain or say like, how is Bread and Butter Farm doing these different types of things that aren't just growing food, we could point to and say like, actually, look, we are zoned for this now. And we were lucky in that Shelburne had that, that option. Not all towns have that. So that had been actually, it's sort of, that had been paved by Shelburne Vineyards, who kind of saw the writing on the wall early, like years and years earlier, and wanted to do some, wine tastings and other like little events to support their sales of their wine, and didn't have like a way to do that on the town level. So they kind of helped to create that zoning for our town. And then that was like, that among other things was part of what then prompted the state of Vermont to change that zoning for all municipalities, which again, we were contacted about supporting that legislation. So it is confusing. Maybe Andrew can speak to how, like, even though we have this like umbrella legislation now that all farms are technically allowed to kind of access that and do these different on-farm events, your town, it still can be tricky depending on your town's willingness to like support that or not.
Yeah, well, and I can't speak to it somewhat, but I also want to be conscious that there's folks from a lot of other states on the call too, but hopefully other states adopt this format that it's, and actually Dr. Chase I think understands the law better than I do because she was involved with the passage of it from what I understand, but that it defines what an accessory on-farm business is, such that it allows farms to stay within what's considered agricultural and not be impacted by the zoning, not get kicked into commercial use. And Vermont, we're what's called a Dillon rule state, which essentially means that the legislature holds the power by default and the towns only have whatever power the legislature gives them. I know other states are what are called home rule states, which is the default is the towns have all the authority unless the legislature takes it away. And so I don't know how that would interact necessarily with zoning in a home rule state. Because I haven't had to learn it because I'm in a Dillon rule state, but I just know that that's again another layer to this that I'm not to distress you all, but it's why I wanted to give you sort of the skills to investigate and find the information rather than give you specific information, because it is hyper localized. It is very different from place to place. But I think this is an aspect that might be more universal, Corie, and I want to ask you, when you say that zoning changed, was that an application for a permit, or was it an application to rezone your farm into a different zone, or was it there's this other term which you might not be familiar with, but there's also this thing called a variance. Do you know which one of those it was?
I should.
No.
I
okay.
feel like it was. I feel like it was actually changing our zoning.
Okay. Yeah,
It wasn't a permit.
Okay, it wasn't a permit. I mean, that's great. I mean, I think if your farm's like bread and butter farm, where you have this wild success, where it makes sense to request that you be in a different zone, that would be the other way to do it. And I'm glad your zoning administrator was supportive of that.
Yeah.
Right. Well, thank you. We are at time, but that was great information, Corie and Andrew. Thank you so much. Participants, it was great to have you. Again, you'll receive, unless we just got 2 new questions. We did, but we'll have to save those. I will shoot our presenters these questions, and hopefully you can get an answer via email. Anyway, thanks so much. We will see you next Wednesday if you're signing on for our next webinar. Otherwise, have a great growing season.
Thank you, everybody.